It's a pleasure to have you here. Diana Heredia, who is our graduate assistant here at the Institute, will do the introductions of all the panelists, and then we'll begin.
Well, thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this book roundtable. We're very happy to have all of our panelists here in person. So I'll start with our respondents. First with us is Mayra E. Alvarez. She's a Provost Early Career Fellow here in the Department of History, and she works on borderlands history. Alvarez has published in peer-reviewed journals such as Archaeologists, Translation and Interpreting Studies, and Hispania, as well as in the Debates in Digital Humanities book series. She's also part of digital initiatives like Torn Apart, Separados, which focuses on the US's 2018 Zero Tolerance Policy, as well as United Fronteras, a trans-border digital repository of projects and material from both sides of the Mexico-US border. And she's also founder of Borderlands Archives Cartography, also a trans-border digital record that locates maps and Borderlands newspapers to facilitate access to this material. With us too is Jonathan Cortez, who's also at present the Early Career Provost Fellow in Borderlands History, also here at the Department of History at UT Austin. Previously, they held the title of the Cesar Chavez Provost Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Latin America, Latino, and Caribbean Studies at Dartmouth College. They received their PhD from Brown University. Their research interests include Latino history, Borderlands history, and the history of camps, as well as the history of race and space. Their current manuscript, The Age of Encampment, details the history of vernacular and federally funded camps along the US-Mexico border for perceived national security, capital accumulation, and labor control from the late 19th century to the late 20th century. Their work has been funded by the Ford Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Mellon Foundation. And now the translator and editor of the book in discussion is Dr. Emilio Zamora, who is a full professor and the Clyde Rabb Littlefield Chair in Texas History, here also in our Department of History. He has prepared or collaborated in the production of 11 books, including 3 single-authored books, and he has received numerous awards for his scholarship and civic engagement. The most recent ones include the 2021 Roy Rosenzweig Distinguished Service Award from the Organization of American Historians, and most recently, the 2023 William C. Powers Jr. Lifetime Service Award, which I hear was yesterday was the ceremony, so congratulations. And his forthcoming publication is a textbook on Mexicans in Texas history that he's co-editing and co-authoring with fellow historians. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody that is here, particularly those that may not be accustomed to coming to events in the history department. But you should know that this is a very special occasion. This is the way we, the history department and the Institute, announces to the public what we do, what we value in what we do. And that includes obviously publications. So I'm very honored to be given the opportunity to present my book. This is what this is, a presentation of a book. I want to speak very briefly about the book, the author, and a couple of other things. And I want to read some excerpts from the book to give you a sense of, I don't know, how I treated this important book. The book originally was published in 1936 and 1937 as Volume 1 and Volume 2, and it was entitled En Defensa de Mi Raza. It was published by Artes, no, not Artes, Artes Gráficas, yes, out of San Antonio, one of the most important publishing houses in the entire hemisphere, particularly to Spanish language works. And it was published in 36 and 37, Volume 1 and Volume 2. The book is dedicated to the youth and the nation. And I like to read this dedication. I think it's very important. These are his words translated by myself. I dedicate this book with deep devotion and care for my nation and my people, and to the Mexican youth of the United States who are witnesses to our struggles and suffering and who will soon become adults, calling on us to recount how we as citizens sought a better future. Perales was one of the most important, arguably one of the most important civil rights leaders of mid-century. He was particularly active between around 1920 till his death around in 1960. And he published these two books, 2 volumes that I put together in one publication with the translated title of In Defense of My People. And he published another book in 1947, Are We Good Neighbors, in which he basically interjects himself and those authors in his book into the politics of Pan-Americanism. He was not only a civil rights leader, but he was also a hemispheric leader in the area of Pan-Americanism. The book is, it has 106 entries. It has, Cárdenas, pásale. How are you?
I'm still fighting with my.
Going around in circles, what we got here.
Okay. Cardenas is with from San Diego, Texas. Wrote a novel on an uprising in South Texas. I'm glad you made it. You must travel a long distance. But we're introducing the book at this point, and then we'll have the discussants comment on the book. What else can I say about the book? Well, it's that this book, as well as the second one that he published in 1947, are very important texts on the history of Mexican Americans. This one, the 2-volume work that I've translated, obviously was only available in Spanish, like many other texts in Mexican American history that don't get used. Historians don't use these texts. This is one of the reasons why Mexicans don't appear in the US textbooks. There are exceptions. My colleague here, Steve Mintz, Professor Steve Mintz, does have a textbook that incorporates Mexican American history, but that is an exception. Generally, textbooks do not incorporate Mexican Americans. The standard curriculum in the state of Texas and other standard curriculums in other parts of the country also do not include them, in large part because many of these works are in Spanish. So what I've done is basically recovered a text. And I'm very fortunate that the Arte Público Press, one of the most successful small presses in the country in terms of titles and awards received, these titles published a book. They have a recovery project at the University of Houston that also that includes tens of thousands of records that they've collected and digitized that are now available to researchers. The collection of Alonso Perales, which is a pretty extensive collection, is also part of the recovery project. So this book, which is part of the civil rights series of Arte Público Press, is part of this larger enterprise of identifying, recovering, and making available in digital form many of the documents that are very important in Mexican American history. Let me say something, read something else that I think is very important that speaks to the title. We're so race conscious in this country in a special way. A lot of other folks are too. But when we use the word raza, sometimes people translate that literally. What he meant is his people, his community. And let me just read some of what I wrote with this in mind to explain what that meant. The book's title greets the reader with a popular Latin American self-reference of La Raza. The Perales turns into the possessive mi raza, meaning my or our people. Jose Vasconcelos, the Mexican historical figure, makes a similar famous declaration that now stands as the motto encapsulating the guiding spirit of Mexico's Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And the motto is, por mi raza hablará el espíritu, a very spiritual statement that expresses a connection with the past. The differences between the two, on the other hand, are as memorable. While Vasconcelos points to a spiritual redemption of a people somewhere beyond their present after the Mexican Revolution, Perales, with a customary bravado of a righteous civil rights leader, confidently shifts our attention to his ongoing and enduring defense of the people that are his people. Vasconcelos was assuring his own raza, his own people, of a wondrous and reconstituted Mexico earned under the fire of an exhausting social revolution. Perales was not yet imagining a restored and comforting future for his people in the United States. He was absorbed in his own insurgency and living out the meaning of his old German cognate, Adolphus, which means ready for battle. Coincidentally, I thought that was really interesting. They named him that. One of the things I wanted to say about the book is that it's written by one of the founders of the major civil rights organizations, so it drew a lot of attention. Perales is one of the major co-founders of the League of United Latin American Citizens, the longest lasting civil rights organization coming out of the Mexican American community. And everybody knew that. He was a very popular figure. He published a lot, primarily in newspapers. He represented the community in the general discourses on Americanization, for example, on immigration of the time period. And he's writing in English and Spanish, which is very important. This is the first generation of Mexicans that produce a significant number of folks that can communicate effectively in both English and Spanish. He's US born, and he has been trained in public schools here, as well as in private Mexican schools. So the book is well received. The other thing I need to say about the book is that the book is in conversation with a lot of other publications that are being produced in the Mexican American community. I've listed some of them here. Los de Abajo, which is written by a Mexican national, but written on the border, and it has to be included, by Mariano Suela of 1915. El Sol, a novel by Conrado Espinosa in the 1920s. Las Aventuras Don Chipote, o Cuando los Pericos Mamen, 1928. Among My People, an autobiography with folklore and history by Jovita Gonzalez, 1932. Los Mexicoamericanos y la Gran Guerra, World War I diary, that I also translated by Jose La Luz Sainz, published in 1933. La Patria Perdida, a novel on immigration by Teodoro Torres. El Mezquite, historical fiction by Elena Zamora de O'Shea, 1935. Santana y la Guerra de Texas, a biography of Jose C. Valadez. The Mexican Question in the Southwest by Emma Tanayuca and Homer Brooks, 1939. And Our Catholic Heritage in Texas, a 7-volume work on the history of the Catholic Church in the state of Texas. Alonso Perales is in this community of authors that are basically conversing with each other in real time at conferences, at meetings, but they're also publishing works that have to be taken together in order to get a full understanding of the Mexican community during this period, and the authors like him. Carlos Castañeda, one of his contemporaries, I wanted to read this. He said the following in the book, Perales invited people to comment on his book. And so and then he printed their commentary in the book itself. So it doesn't just include 106 letters and reports and so forth, and articles. It also includes statements about key historical figures. He said, we're not exaggerating. Let me go back. Anyway, let me just do this. We're not exaggerating when we say that he is a defender of the raza. And although he is not the only one to have fought for our dignity and rights in recent years, no one else has done as much. He was in fact called the defender of la raza, el defensor de la raza. That was the popular name that was given to him in honor of all the work that he did on behalf of the Mexican American community. I could say a lot more, but I'll leave it for later. I think I should leave time for Jonathan and Mayra.
All right. So who wants to go first?
So we're gonna take
10 minutes.
Okay, so I can make sure I have my time. Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Emilio, for taking this task of translating, such an amazing work by Perales. I am familiar with this work because I graduated from the University of Houston, and that's where the archives are. And it's an amount, there's a lot of documentation that's, this is just not even one fraction of it. And also, just as he was, a bilingual and translator as well, I can imagine how what that implied, and to do this, when it's very complicated to do so. When I read his work, I read in the Spanish form. I'm a bilingual too. Spanish is my first language, and grew up listening to both. So when I read his work in Spanish, it spoke to me differently for some reason. And so having another translation, it just made me realize other things that I haven't noticed before. And I think it has to do with the language, right? And so speaking to this, it also tells us how well-rounded of an intellectual he was. He had a great knowledge in history, both from Mexico and the US, from Texas, very proud Texan. And what I enjoyed so much when reading the book in English was that, I could see how, well, he's introducing us about this public sphere that is very male-dominated, right? And what the community, the Mexican Americans, the Mexicanos, were facing at the time in the 1920s and 1930s. And, such as racial segregations, poor education, lack of housing, proper housing, lynchings, which is one of the first readings that we have, or the letters regarding lynching, health issues, and so on and so forth. And then see that, come into realization later on, some of those things that he started to fight for in the 20s. Just to kind of go in a chronological format, now it's surprising me how at the beginning, his 1920s letters and documents speaks to a Mexican and Mexican American community, and he used sometimes matching or following the Anglo-Saxon, ways, and that kind of, well, because in English, again, when I was reading English, it kind of made me comfortable. Why should, Mexicans emulate, or Mexican Americans emulate or match, the Anglo-Saxon? But then that transitions later on into, that he starts to go more in depth about, starts to stay away from that and starts to point out more specifically and speaks more clearly about the struggles and how, the Texas, especially Texas laws are not serving the community, right? In many various ways. And so that's one of the things that's surprising. I don't know if, again, it was because I was reading it now in English, but that it stood out more clearly to me. And also the other thing that stood out was at the beginning, that deductive form where he was like, this is, you want to write to your representatives, you want to write to certain people, blah, blah, blah. He'll give you the format, right? Like, this is how you do it. This is how you will fill out the information, send it, make copies, document that they have received the confirmation of receipt and all of that. So to me, that was like I said, a very rounded intellectual that knew his audience, who he was speaking to, and according to those audience, he would place himself and talk for the Mexican Americans and Mexicans, and speak to the Mexican Americans as well, and Texans, and the various forms he used to refer to the public. And as a Mexican American, Mexicano, American of origin, Mexicano origin. So again, I didn't notice that so much when I was in Spanish, because maybe the language pointing out to other things, that I observed. But so that speaks to the importance of having this translation, right, of his work and his legacy, and to just think how this will come into classrooms, or just, more readers, and another readers, and now generations of even Mexican Americans who might not speak Spanish or read Spanish, as fluently. Now this is also available to them, right? At least one of the portions of his work that he has done. And also to inform us, the book also what it this documentation does, this letter, his writings in general, like the relationship he had with the prensa, with the newspapers and the media, right? He used the newspaper because, again, we're talking 1920s, 1930s, so no social media then, but he knew the importance and he knew how to get to the people. And he also knew that, you know, the importance of newspapers in Spanish. I mean, he was particularly writing in Spanish, and knew the power of that and how it moved people. And many times I love how he threatened, you know, some people to say, well, I'm going to publish this in the newspapers and let's see how the people react. I mean, you're going to have a lot of problems with, you know, in Texas when this is published. But also, you know, using that platform to, again, educate, to inform, and to show his commitment and support towards the community, as well as the radio, right? He spoke a lot in the radio, and he mentioned some of the instances when he did, which again, you could see all this abilities that he had gained throughout the years, right? And also as a diplomat in other countries in Latin America. And you can see some of those strategies that he used while writing some of these documents. What also, and this was in Spanish and English, what also got my attention was that in multiple times in different writings, he mentioned, right, he kept remembering Hidalgo and Cuauhtemoc, but also the participants of the Texas independence, right, to point out the rich history, right, behind the Mexicanos and Mexican Americans, or Texans, and I think that's that if we look more in depth, it talks about as well, you know, that in how a nation is created, right, and how we must embrace all those identities and all that history, that we cannot exclude, you know, this or that we have to be more conscious about the makeup of a nation, right? What creates a nation, and which is, of course, its people. But yeah, and that is something that I always grabs my attention, how he goes to Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo, who was the padre de la independencia, the father of independence in Mexico, when it became as a nation, and Cuauhtemoc, the indigenous people, right, the Aztecs, and its fight towards the Spaniards' conquest, but also the Texas independence that he points out very often as well, right? That Texas is what it is because also the participation of those Mexican Americans of Mexican origin who fought along this other people for the independence. So it's a very complex history that he's telling us, right? But we kind of scratch the surface in this particular book. Like I said, it's a huge archive and documents that I'm so thankful that he saved, and he didn't discard anything, as well as the family. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there because, well, I'll start with one of the questions for you is, what were the challenges to translate this book because of the content? You know, there's a lot of the legal language, you know, there's all different forms of languages. It's not just, you know, so I know as a translator, that must be one of the biggest challenges, but how do you overcome that and get to do this?
Can I answer it, please? Translating a text is very challenging. Particularly in my experience with the text that I've been translating. This is not the first translation I've done, but you obviously translate meaning and not necessarily the actual words. You do translate the words, but you're really going after the meaning, and sometimes the meaning is not apparent, and so you have to look at the context, both the context within the writing itself, but also the historical contemporary society that is also part of that other context. But one of the things, it's so very difficult is using formal Spanish, informal Texas Spanish, and of course there are typos and this kind of stuff. But one of the things I wanted to say about one of the challenges has to do with language, that there's great rich texture in all of this, in part because when he speaks to the English language audience, but he's also speaking to the Spanish language audience. Sometimes he's speaking to both at the same time. And that's important to know. For example, I believe that when he spoke to the English language audience, and then he includes that letter or that article in Spanish or English, that complicates things even further. But what he's doing is he's basically performing for the Mexican audience. He's not just speaking to the white audience. He's telling Mexicans, look, I'm standing up to these people. I have integrity. I mean what I say. What I say to you, I'll say it to them too. And I thought that was an amazing act of performing, you know, his principles, his values, his persona as a major political leader. That's what I found. Again, translation can be very difficult, but you also find these gems. This is a gem, to be able to see somebody speak in English with the expectation that it's going to be read in Spanish. So you have a reputation to maintain as a civil rights leader. You have to be honest enough to be able to speak the same way, regardless of the setting. And I think that's what he's doing. And in doing that, he basically establishes his integrity as a leader. He's honest, he's transparent, he's not speaking to one group differently than from another. And I thought that there's moments like that that makes translation really worthwhile.
Well, I definitely got that from this translation. So yeah, it's emotion, like you said, especially when he's speaking to the community, right? And from the heart, really, because he's fighting for all of this against all this injustice. And that's why I was like,
yeah. Let me give an example. I think it's important to illustrate this. At one point, he gets into this discussion with the official representing the Americanization movement. And of course, there's great pressure nationally on groups like Mexicans to Americanize, to basically discard all that they know themselves to be and to adopt kind of blindly. And of course, people aren't doing it. That's not how they live. But Perales is urging people to acculturate. I use the concept of self-acculturation. And it comes up in this debate where this fellow is saying things like Mexicans need to change if they expect to be treated equally, that kind of stuff. And so he responds and he says, we're acculturating already because you don't know it. I'm urging through LULAC, Mexican Americans to be Americanized so that they can become effective participants in the political process with constitutional claims for equal rights, for example. What you're doing is that you're not being honest, because if you really want us to acculturate, on your side, you have to guarantee us equal treatment. That would encourage Mexicans to acculturate, but you're only asking us to acculturate without promising social assimilation or the opportunities for incorporation in American society on an equal basis. That's what I mean by this gem, that there's really deep thought, a lot of integrity when he speaks.
yeah, I love it how he lives that like in most of his letters or writings, it just leaves it open. Like you want to have a discussion, you want to have some comments, but like it's always open for discussions, right? He's never on a defense.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Emilio, for the invitation. Thank you, Jorge and Diana, for hosting, and the Institute for Historical Studies. Always great to be here. My comments are prepared, and they definitely are under 10 minutes, I promise. So Alonso S. Perales is one of the foremost thinkers and forces of Mexican-American civil rights in the United States 20th century. His collection of documents, collated into 2 volumes titled Defensa de Mi Raza, published in 1936 and 1937, respectively, feature Perales's writings as well as make clear to feature Perales's writings as he struggled to make clear to local, state, and national government officials, as well as to make clear to other ethnic Mexicans that US citizens of Mexican descent deserved humanity, dignity, and respect. For Perales, the United States had a duty to protect the rights of all its people, and that the people had an obligation to reciprocate. The articles, letters, and speeches that make up the 2 volumes exemplify the vastness of Perales's interests, or perhaps these writings exemplify the vastness of the United States' abandonment of the Mexican American community. Educational segregation, police brutality, anti-immigration legislation, residential and commercial segregation, and labor exploitation are just some of the issues Perales pointed out. Simply, the United States was not upholding their end of the agreement for, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Perales penned his first entry on May 15, 1923, titled "A Theatrical Presentation That is Unfair to the American People," where he writes to the editors of the Washington Post urging the removal of a Western satirical comedy titled "The Bad Man," in which a character named Pancho Lopez and his men are shown stealing and living lavishly. Perales writes, quote, "Such exhibitions tend to create the wrong impressions that all Mexicans are bandits," end quote. He goes on to highlight the number of lynchings of Black and brown people in the United States at the hands of white law enforcement and vigilantes as a rhetorical device, and questions, quote, "Suppose that Mexicans would represent you in their theaters as the typical American lyncher. Would this not make your blood boil?" With the same vigor with which Ida B. Wells penned "Lynching, Our National Crime" in 1919, did Perales hold up a mirror to American history. Now, 100 years later, the mirror has resurfaced in the form of the English translation of Perales's work, In Defense of My People, translated by Dr. Emilio Zamora and published by Arte Press in 2021, offers new opportunities and possibilities for Perales's work. My brief remarks today will touch on 2 points that I found most interesting and that spoke to me most as I engaged with In Defensa de Mi Raza's English translation. First, I will speak on why Perales's choice to write in Spanish was intentional and political. And second, I will engage Zamora's English translation as the possibilities this book holds for a 21st century educational landscape. Alonso Perales wrote predominantly in Spanish, while similarly a colonial language in the United States, English held dominance and continues to hold dominance over Spanish. For instance, a 1918 English-only statute in Texas made it a misdemeanor for any teacher or administrator to use language other than English in schools or to prescribe textbooks not printed in the English language. This law would remain active until 1968. Therefore, Perales's use of the Spanish language is politically intentional. He wanted to communicate his thoughts with other Spanish-speaking people, but must have known that his books would never see the light of day in a K-12 classroom, both because of the language in which they were written and the content. Perales reminds me of another outspoken Mexican-American educational and women's civil rights advocate by the name of Maria Rebecca Latigo de Hernandez from San Antonio, who by the mid-1930s was one of the first ethnic Mexican women on the radio and chose to speak only in Spanish. This was at a time when English was the only language permitted in Texas schools, government documents, and many places of business. So to write and speak in a language on which a cultural genocide is being waged is a powerful move. They understood the value of their work beyond the message. Making Spanish content accessible through radio waves and newspaper articles kept their communities plugged in and the Spanish language alive for adults and children. When a school system doles out corporeal punishment for speaking the only language your parents taught you because that is all they knew, what message can that possibly send besides the idea that Spanish was bad and English was good? Further, how do legacies of anti-Spanish and English-only laws factor into the development of Mexican-American identity throughout the 20th century? Over and over again, we see bilingual education become a rallying point for Mexican-American civil rights and eventually the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. The English-only laws and the spanking of Spanish-speaking children festered within them the idea that if they were American citizens, English was the only worthy language. Therefore, Perales and his 2 volumes of En Defensa de Mi Raza was an intentional plot to advocate for the civil rights of Spanish-speaking individuals and to assert the fact that ethnic Mexicans and Spanish-speaking peoples were capable of reading and developing a political consciousness in the areas of law, education, popular culture, and immigration. To choose only to write in Spanish, or rather to choose predominantly to write in Spanish, I can imagine meant that few publishers saw profit in printing Perales's work. They didn't believe there was a market for Spanish language books in the United States. Further, they didn't believe ethnic Mexicans were educated enough to read or buy books. And so you've spoken about this a bit, Emilio, but I would like to hear maybe if there's any more to say about this, what it might have been like for Perales to try and get these books published. If you've explored anything in the archive in terms of communication with Arte Gráfica press or anything like that. And then you've spoken about this as well, but what was it like in your experience to get it published or in the translation published? And can you talk a bit about the Recovering U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project and how you saw this book come to fruition? On my second point, Zamora's translation of In Defense of My People opens up possibilities for pedagogical innovation and to rethink how historians engage with the work of past intellectuals. Solely based on the language in which it was published, to say nothing of its contents, Perales's writings would legally not be allowed in Texas public schools until the second half of the 20th century. By then, Perales's influence had largely faded with his passing on May 9th, 1960, and the rise of a more progressive and radical take on issues such as immigration, education, and labor. However, Zamora's English translation gives revival to Perales's work and expands the possibilities for its inclusion in K-12 and university classrooms. I can envision an assignment where each student uses one sort of entry that Perales writes about as an entry point into a research project about Mexican-American civil rights, or bringing together the original Spanish publication and the English translation could make for a really dynamic Spanish lesson, touching on both language acquisition and content simultaneously. Courses such as Mexican-American studies, Spanish language classes, ethnic studies, and US history classes will greatly benefit. Zamora's contributions, I believe, really shine in the notes and bibliography section. They're really fantastic. Since most of Perales's writings consist of memos, speeches, correspondence, and other documents not geared towards an academic audience, they're void of context, definitions, identifications, and other markers important and necessary to contextualize his writings. Within the time frame of the to contextualize his writings within the time frame of the 1930s Mexican-American civil rights movement. It is in the notes section where Zamora settles contradictions, provides citations for Perales's writings, and give the background necessary to understand Perales's reasoning for his arguments on Mexican-American civil rights in the first half of the 20th century. Zamora does the work of a historian while doing the work of a translator. This strategic move provides another argument towards the importance of this book. Not only does In Defense of My People strike a revival of Perales's writing for a 21st century audience, but this publication brings together one public intellectual from the past, Perales, with one public intellectual from the present, Zamora, to form a hybrid history meets primary source collection meets Mexican-American civil rights encyclopedia. In this way, a more cohesive understanding of Mexican-American civil rights during the 20th century is contained within the 320 pages of In Defense of My People. Overall, I see Zamora's translation as an effort towards healing the linguistic schism that has formed between the ethnic Mexicans in Texas and the nation more broadly. By being able to dig into Perales's work in both English and Spanish, a larger audience will be exposed to the long historical plight of Mexican Americans in the United States. As Zamora writes, Perales's goal for the book was, quote, to help Mexicans equip themselves against discrimination and to participate effectively in the civic culture of the nation. I believe Dr. Zamora is reigniting and vastly expanding on these goals. So in addition to my earlier question, Emilio, if you could speak more to your own goals for this book, where do you see its circulations? How do you, what hopes do you have to in the classrooms for academics and for the general public to engage with In Defense of My People? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you noticed the notes and that is. You get to the significance of the translation, I think, when you look at the notes, the explanations that I offer, particularly when there's instances where meanings seem to contradict or are not consistent. But anyway, to your first question, you build a very close relationship with an author when you translate, because you have to read the text very carefully to be able to capture the meaning that was intended. So you get to know the person very well. I think that's one of the other things that is so important about translations. I don't know, more directly your question, if he tried to publish this book in English during his lifetime, I don't know of that, but I do know that there's cases like Jose de Lusain's, who had translated his diary, World War I diary. He tried to publish elsewhere with and was not given the opportunity. That has come up on a number of occasions with different authors, that Mexicans are seen as basically being regional, isolated, separated from the rest of American society, physically, but also culturally, including language. And so that I believe that the publishers did believe that there was a great deal of relevance in the work that they were doing to the greater society. But I don't know the specific instances where he was encouraged, where he was refused an opportunity to be published elsewhere. What are my plans for the book? I hope that the book, I mean, the reason I translated it is so that people could incorporate it into their own work, particularly historians that are writing on other communities, other parts of the country that just don't seem to feel responsible for incorporating Mexicans. I think that's the big. There's great dismissal, and dismissal is a form of discrimination in my mind, to dismiss texts because you can't read them. It's understandable, but in the end, you've got to deal with the fact that act is an act of dismissal, and that contributes to the problems of the Mexican Americans, who are seen as the sleeping giant, the regionally focused group of people that are not really integrated into general discourses in American society. I think that contributes to that. One of the things that I've done, along with other people that have been promoting ethnic studies before the state legislature and the State Board of Education, is we've asked that the State Board of Education expand its curriculum to include Mexican origin people, as well as Mexican women and African American, Asian Americans, and indigenous people. And I can tell you that there's very few people mentioned that are of Mexican origin in the standard curriculum. He does not appear in the standard curriculum. They may have placed him in the next year. This last year I did, but I didn't notice it. But up until last year, he was not in there. And by the way, there's so many other achievements that we haven't even mentioned. He was, just to note one very important one, he was an official delegate to the inaugural meeting of the UN, and he helped write the charter. So this fellow is pretty extraordinary. He does deserve a place in the general discourse over American history. And I hope that this publication will encourage people, once they read it, that he deserves to be there. And I will continue in my testimony before the State Board of Education to argue for including him, as well as so many other people. And I think, I don't know if I answered all of your questions, but I really appreciate that you noticed the notes. They're very extensive. The notes on my other translation are very extensive on the World War I diary. I need to say this: in our profession, we don't get enough credit for translations. I don't think people appreciate the significance of translations. They don't rate at the same level, let us say, as single authored books. And this is very important in our profession, because it's the kind of works that you do that determine what kinds of promotions you get. And translations do not have the same value in our profession as do say, like I said, single author books. And for us, it's particularly important that is us Mexican Americans. who have to consider recovering texts so that the subject matter can be incorporated. This is a recovering text is one of the most important undertakings in the writing of Mexican American history. To be then denied what I believe to be legitimate rights for promotion and so forth is, I think, unfortunate. But that's just the way it is. We're not being encouraged to translate texts that have not been incorporated. And by the way, recovery is not just a matter of bringing books like this into the English language. It also involves bringing the subject matter too into this general discourses on American history. Mexican American history is not being incorporated fairly, just like the Mexican American community have not been incorporated on an equal basis. I think it just reflects the larger problem.
He was one of the founders of LULAC.
Yes.
Now, it's strange for an activist in the Southwest in the United States fighting for the end of segregation in schools, the end of better working conditions, et cetera, to write in Spanish if the goal of the political goal was acculturation. That in order to gain rights, the community, this Mexican American community, should acculturate. According to you, I haven't read the arguments he's offering. It seems like he, by writing in Spanish, he's doing the opposite. He's not seeking acculturation, he's seeking to draw an ethnic identity as a value onto itself. What is striking about this strategy of publication in Spanish is that it's part of a long-standing tradition of a public experience in Spanish in the United States. It goes back to the late 18th century Philadelphia. I have a student who's working on newspapers in Spanish in mid-19th century, and he's calculated about 800 of them in San Francisco, in New Orleans, New York, and Philadelphia. It's a lot of newspapers in Spanish, and there's a very lively debates about all sorts of things, including why is Latin America, because many of these individuals are kind of taking issue with white supremacy and antebellum views of race and drawing differences with the South, particularly with Mexico, and conceptions of mestizaje, miscegenation, notions of citizenship that avoid racial classifications, et cetera. So the category of Latin America is created in these newspapers, in Philadelphia, in New Orleans, in New York, San Francisco, as much as in Latin America itself or in Paris. So it seems that there's a continuity between what these guys are doing in the mid-19th century and defining Latin America via the United States, conceptions of race in the United States, particularly lynching in San Francisco, Chilean miners, conceptions of race in New Orleans, of free blacks, conceptions of race in New York, of free blacks as well, particularly the population coming from Cuba and Puerto Rico. That these guys in the 1920s decide to call themselves not Mexicans, not Mexican Americans, but Latin Americans. What does it mean? And what does it mean that there's an activism that on the one hand argues for acculturation, but on the other hand, is using actively Spanish as a way of communicating political demands?
Well, he's speaking to different audiences with different multiple strategies. There is no one single strategy. There's multiple strategies. But to answer the question about Latin American self-referent, the reason they're using that term, and they're using other terms for other reasons that reflect multiple strategies, but the reason they're using Latin American is because they're making a hemispheric argument. They're saying Mexicans in the United States are part of the larger of the hemisphere and are connected to other Latin origin, Latin American people. And that was an attempt to expand the civil rights movement. That is, it's part of the Pan-Americanist strategy. And they wanted to present themselves as being a significant part of the hemispheric population connected to the people that are the true Americans, the first Americans. They were making those claims as descendants of indigenous people. We have the right to claim the right to prior occupancy, for example. But they're also saying, if you want to deal with Latin America, incorporate us. If you want to talk about improving relations between Latin American countries and the US, how about starting at home and improving relations between white people and Mexicans or Latin Americans? Let me just give you an example. In 1943, they sat down with the state representative in the state of Texas and wrote up a civil rights bill for him. And he agreed to take it to Austin to submit the bill, basically granting Latin Americans equal rights, civil rights legislation. And I have the notes by one of the participants in the discussion of that bill. What they wrote, that first draft, said that the state needed to guarantee equal rights to Latin Americans. The idea was to get that bill accepted and made into law so that African origin people could then claim as Latin Americans that they deserved equal rights, and then US African origin people could then follow. That was the plan. So that the idea of using a self-referent Latin America is part of this large strategy. Now, when he's speaking to different audiences, he has different strategies. He's speaking to the Anglo population and is basically proposing an exchange. We'll become American, but you need to treat us like Americans. And that was dictated by circumstances. He's been criticized a lot, him as well as others, for being accommodationist and for not rebelling against this notion of being admitted on a conditional basis. That is, as long as you act as an American, then we will accept you. He's saying that's hypocritical, because you're only asking us to change culturally, but you're not affording us the opportunity to be integrated in American institutions. Consequently, he's speaking to the English speaking audience and telling them that, but he's also telling the Mexicans, you have a responsibility. You need to prepare yourself to make use of opportunities that may arise in the future. When they become true, when they adopt a more honest approach to Americanization, you need to be ready. And anyway, you need to, the other thing that he's saying, you need to do for yourselves as well. You need to make sure that you keep your children in school. Otherwise, they're pulling children out because they're in the migratory workforce, and they pull the children out of school before the term is over, and they bring them in late. And that's one of the reasons why children don't advance educationally. So he's telling them, we need to be honest about this. I understand that you have to pull the children out. You need child labor in order for the family to survive. But look at the consequences. We're not making generational improvements in part because of that. So we need to prepare ourselves as civic actors, but we also have to prepare ourselves for ourselves. We need to educate our children. We need to learn the English language so we can make effective use of our constitutional rights. We need to train youth to become attorneys so that they can defend us in court, and so forth, so on. So he's saying different things, but he's saying it publicly with both groups witnessing what he's saying. That's what I think is so extraordinary about him. He's using multiple strategies, speaking to different publics, but he's doing it very openly, very confidently. I don't know what else I could say. Do you want to add something to that?
Oh, it seems like he's a incrementalist at the very beginning of his career. But my question is, from a policy perspective, the introduction of his novel was, this is for the young people, but 80 years later, we're still not represented in the Capitol. There's 17% of us that are representative of Mexican Americans, Latinos in the Capitol. Yet we're 40% of the state, Mexican Americans and Latinos. My question is, where did that 80 years gap go, where we stop pushing as much as we should, as far as not just registering voters, but just like voting as much as we should?
what has happened since then, since he was urging
Yeah,
young
that
people
urge seems to
to
go
assume
away.
the mantle of fighting for Mexican rights? Well,
Is it Mexican rights or Mexican American rights? I'm confused when you say Mexican. Are we talking about people from Mexico, the FAA?
they're using the terms interchangeably, just like we use them now. Mexican is a term that's used to designate our origins. Mexican American can be justified on the grounds that we may be of Mexican origin, but living here and culturally speak and represent the larger population.
And
But
there are
people use it-
Guatemalans or Peruvians as well.
Well, people use the terms depending on the circumstance. If it's a personal conversation in Spanish, of course, they use the word Mexicano. And sometimes some of us insist on recognizing our true origins as Mexicans and as indigenous people as well. There's a lot of people that privately adopt the self-reference of Indio. So the community is so diverse, it's understandable, and the situations that they're facing changes so rapidly and drastically that people have to sort of, what is it? Adapt, yes. But I didn't understand your question too well, but to the extent that I did, I think this idea of acculturating for purposes of becoming effective civic actors, that's what he's saying. I think that's worked. I think it's some cost. And the cost is involved the loss of language, for example, and so forth and so on. But I think that has worked. I think we are seeing across time that the academic performance of Mexican students has increased, has improved. That doesn't mean that the problem of segregation and discrimination is diminished to a great extent. I think the one thing that really characterizes the history of Mexican American people is that they have been incorporated, but they continue to be incorporated on an unequal basis. You know, I mean, you can move up into at least during this period for sure, become an attorney, but then your clients are all going to be poor, so your income is going to be less than that of your counterparts of the white population. So that there's just different kinds of problems. There's inequality between the Mexican population, the larger society, but there's internal inequality that becomes even more serious. There's record numbers of people that are graduating high school and college in our time, but there's also record numbers of people, disproportionate number of Mexican Americans or Mexicans that are dropping out or that are not being educated, prepared fully to make use of college university opportunities. I think that concept of change, improvement, along with the persistence of inequality, I think that's the kind of framework that I think is very useful in understanding this situation. Sometimes it's difficult to understand. How can you argue that things haven't improved if you see record numbers of young people graduating from high school, going to Ivy League schools? Well, you have to take into account the fact that they're also registering high dropout rates.
Alberto.
Thank you so much, Emilio, and everyone for this discussion. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. Emilio, in your opening comments, you compared Perales with Jose Vasconcelos of Mexico, famously known partly for his 1925 book on La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race, in which he advocated this idea that the mixture of 5 races, the Mongol, indigenous Indian, the white European, and the black race would create this 5th race, the cosmic race, and that there lay part of the strength of Latin American and Mexican identity, that this 5th race was coming about. This, let's call it the Hispanic notion of race mixing was, of course, in stark contrast with what develops in the United States, which is, of course, that from race mixing, what will happen will be a kind of degeneration, and that to that end, there were these laws against, racial mixing and laws for eugenics, sterilization, all these kinds of things So the comparison to Perales is interesting because, of course, Perales and Vasconcelos are both lawyers. They both live in the same time period. They both lived in Washington, D.C. So I'm wondering, how does Perales respond to the concept of race mixing as part of the an intrinsic merit of the, let's call it, the Mexican American or Latin American civilization, as opposed to this divisive, racist, white supremacist structure that had been cultivated not just in legislatures and townships, but also in universities. Universities in the US at the time taught countless courses on eugenics and were quite against racial mixing. So part of my question is, how does Perales in his work of 1936-37 discuss or address this issue of race mixing, whether it's in a similar way to Vasconcelos? And the second one, more generally, since he lived in this vastly white supremacist moment, how did he respond or succeed against white supremacy, considering that he was, as you've underlined, a leader in the civil rights movement, something that is routinely excluded or underestimated by many historians? Thank you.
Well, the racial regime in Mexico that Vasconcelos describes involves some problems with racial mixture itself. They didn't speak very favorably to the contribution of indigenous people to that mixture. That aside, Perales never really addressed the question of racial mixture, although indirectly he did. He didn't directly address this issue of these new people that would blend together and create a new nation and so forth. I don't think that was part of his vision. What he did address was another important racial issue, and that had to do with whiteness. Mexicans were classified as whites, but they were treated as whites. They were the other white group. And Mexicans like Perales now and then would argue within that those racialized parameters. We're white. You say we're white. You ought to treat it as white people, but you don't. That issue didn't start getting resolved really until 1954. Politically speaking and legally speaking, when LULAC lawyers went to the Supreme Court and were able to get a decision that declared that Mexicans legally were the other white group. Yes, they were designated white, but they were not being treated as white. This is the political argument that was being made before 54. In 54, the Supreme Court granted Mexicans a protective status as the other white group. And so that's another story that takes us into the post-1950s with all kinds of legal fights about where do you place the Mexicans in this racial structure. You declare them white, but you don't treat them as white. Now the Supreme Court says, well, this is how you make sense of it. They are an oppressed minority. They are the object of discrimination, and they're also white. It creates problems between some Mexican-American leaders and African-American leaders. Some Mexican-American leaders are accused of being racist for, quote, abandoning the racial cause in favor of African-Americans and Mexicans, and basically asking to be treated as whites for what they believe to be, And that was unfair. And there's some historians that have then adopted this critique of Mexicans in recent writings on whiteness, that when they argued for whiteness, they were abandoning the racial cause. They weren't doing that. These folks are operating within conditions that are circumstances beyond their control. They oftentimes move strategically based on openings, not on openings that they create, but that are afforded by circumstances out of their control. Whiteness provides that. You call us white, treat us like whites.
Emilio.
The response was what?
Yeah, thank you. In the 1930s census, U.S. Census, of course, Mexican Americans are excluded from the white category. By the 40s and 50s, they've become white by definition. But then by the 90s, it's optional. Person self-identifies as white, and they're white. Otherwise, Hispanics are not white. Did Perales see this transition during his life? Mexicans were not white in the 30s. They became white in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
Did he see that as a success, or did he see that mainly as a ruse, basically giving, like a second-class citizenship? You're white, but we're still gonna treat you as not white.
He saw the categorization of Mexicans as white as not being honest and sincere. And when in 1930, the US Bureau of the Census tried to move him from the white category into a colored category, they protested vehemently. This was one of the issues in the 1930s. And he was trying to maintain, as well as other Mexican leaders, the argument, this position. First, American society doesn't know where to place us. They're very ambivalent and unsure. We need to, and that creates openings. Because we're white, we should be able to be treated like whites. It provided negotiating opportunities at the same time that they understood that American society wasn't honest about these things. So that's why they moved legally into the courts to settle once and for all their position in American society. And the position, according to the Supreme Court, is that they were neither white nor colored. They're another group in themselves. You see, but yeah, race was an important issue all the way throughout. And I think it really comes out when people debate whiteness.
In LULAC, did anyone in LULAC?
Thank you.
But just to continue, Al's train of thought. Did anyone in LULAC in the 20s and 30s argue for not the category of white or color, but the category of, because implicit in the category of Latin American, the very origins of that category in the mid-19th century is the emphasis on mixing, the same thing of Vasconcelos, but it goes back to the mid-19th century. And even earlier, it goes back to Chilpancingo, the Constitution of 1814. So we are doing away with all racial categories in order to establish citizenship. There are no racial categories. They're all Americanos. And by the mid-19th century, Latin America means essentially a critique of white supremacy in terms of we are mixed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, in the 20s and 30s, in LULAC, are they embracing that conception of saying we are not white, we are not color, we are mixed, we are mestizo?
No, they said we're Mexican. And they said we're Latin American. Our identities are cultural identity, which in their minds is broader than race. Okay.
And yet they're using category race.
Huh?
They're using category raza.
Well, but raza is not race in their minds. They said we're simply Mexicans and Latin Americans. When they then began to debate the issue of whiteness, they debated as an opportunity to pry something open as space so that they could then make claims for themselves as whites, because that's what was being dictated by society. You're either white or you're not. And if you want entry into American society, you have to be white. Mexicans, in their minds, were fortunate that in a court case in the 1800s, they were classified as whites. The same, the Bureau of the Census and continued to, they're very inconsistent, but they are seen as white. But the whiteness category is not meant to allow them entry into American society. It's being used to separate them. Because when they make the argument we're white, you ought to treat us like white, the response was, if you're white, then you have no claims.
Emilio?
But it's Mexican or Latin American. Those are the self-reference that they're using.
I want to change the conversation slightly to a teaching challenge, because it seems to me Perales is a tough sell in today's classroom, because he comes across as liberal, and nobody likes liberals too much these days. So how do you sell him and his importance to your students who want him to be way more radical than he comes across?
Well, I think one of the ways you do it is by using the language that basically governs the discourse. And one of the things that has emerged as a very important part of that language is what is it, civic values. I think one way, and again, you need to be do guerrilla fighting. You have to move with the circumstances that provide you openings. And I think the recent support for teaching civic values is an opportunity. The 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause reflects values. The egalitarian principles in our Constitution represent values that we need to teach, but we need to teach them on the basis of actual historical experiences where people like Perales are saying, we're US born or we're naturalized citizens, but we've demonstrated loyalty to this nation and to the principles in the Constitution. They're more often say that than the latter, so that we ought to be. So I think this question of teaching values provides an opening for teachers to incorporate the history of civil rights in the
Why do we have
classroom.
I mean, it's unclear to me, why do we have to teach anyone, in this case, a civil rights activist in the 1930s, who is insufficiently radical from the perspective of our students today? I mean, we're teaching history and the past was different from the present, so should just the fact that he was a leader of a civil rights movement.
Well, but he's a champion of integration on an equal basis. That is enough to argue for including him in the curriculum. And that's radical enough, if you want to put it in those kinds of terms. I see it as I think he would see it. I think if he was here, would say, look at the opportunities. What is the obvious opportunity? For me, it's this decision by the State Board of Education to teach civic values. We do that as a matter of course in our classrooms. But these people are suggesting we don't do it enough. And because we don't do it enough, we're undermining national unity and so forth. So all that stuff. But for us, it represents an opening. Yes, we can teach civic values connected with claims for equal rights. And you don't have to classify that as a liberal, moderate, or a radical proposition. I think in our world, you have to be very careful about the use of those terms. I mean, you go to the state legislature, you try to testify and say, you know, I'm a radical. That's it for you. They're going to listen to you. They're not, or if you say I'm a liberal.
Yeah. To this point too, I think one of the great things about Perales is that you can kind of create a spectrum of different people that are operating at this time, which I know you do in your books, like more kind of worker oriented, more
That's right.
Going down the civil rights oriented.
That's right. Good point.
But to this question that I was thinking about is when I've used Perales, and thank you for this book, because I can now use it in my classrooms and I'm really excited about it. And the excerpts that I've used of Perales, the hard thing I have sometimes with getting across to my students is how non-representative he was of the Mexican-American population. A guy that goes to law school, Washington, DC, he's going to Nicaragua, right, on diplomatic missions. So my question, I guess, is how in a way did this unique biography give him a very like unique lens at looking at what's mostly Mexican-American? And then the kind of sub-question, what were maybe some of the limitations to his kind of like broader like travels that maybe made him miss some things?
Actually, it's an excellent question because Carlos Castañeda, also in LULAC at the time, is also very representative of the Mexican American population.
But the first point you make is a very important one. At that very same time, Emma Tenayuca is the head of the Communist Party in the state of Texas and is leading one of the largest unions in the country, mostly of women, led by women, calling for, you know, that's going on at the same time. A little bit earlier than that, there's people that rise up in arms in South Texas. Cardenas has shown that with his novel, historical novel. Yes, that's important to know. These people are in conversation, sometimes in opposition to each other, sometimes in collaboration with each other. And that's a very important point to make. But the other point you make, this dilemma, you know, where do you place him? Where do you place him? But you know, he comes from a very humble family. And he becomes an orphan at the age of 12. He loses both his mom and dad. He's sleeping in porches. He gets adopted by a very good family, a caring family. And he was able then to do things he was extraordinary. One of the things that he does that a lot of young people are doing their time period, they go to business schools or become clerks with the hopes of then getting a good job and then going to college. And that's exactly what he did. That was his plan. As far as his personal story is concerned, he's very astute in planning these moves to become an attorney, which and then he, of course, he hooks up with and this is the other contradiction or inconsistency in his life. He supports diplomatic missions that basically force the US influence into the Central America and the Caribbean and Mexico. He's part of that effort that often uses military action to maintain all these countries within the sphere of the US. He's complicit in this. How do you explain that? I think it's part of his career plans. I think he also believes in what he's doing. He speaks very harshly of Sandino in his archives. He has correspondence with other LULAC members, and they're basically denigrating Sandino and his movement. You know, on the other hand, another thing I should say about this
So
diplomatic
they're Catholic? They are Catholic? Is he Catholic like
Yes.
Castellana?
He's a major Catholic. But what was I going to say? He also sees it as a way to prepare himself for his leadership and the civil rights movement. He writes constitutions. He trains people on diplomatic relations and so forth, so on. And it's because of that he's named the consul of Nicaragua in San Antonio for about 30 years. And that's how he's able to participate in the UN meeting, because the Nicaraguans include him in their delegation. But he's a moderate. There's instances in his private papers where he speaks harshly of the very poor people that he represents, in all fairness, honesty. It's amazing that anyone like him who's already upwardly mobile. He's not a member of the middle class. None of these people are, but they're upwardly mobile. What's extraordinary about these people is that they're so attached to this community. They're one generation removed at most. So it's not difficult for them to then attach themselves to these causes of this cause and give it that civil rights title. But he's a moderate. He's not an Emma Tenayuca. He's not a Basilio Ramos or De La Rosa who are up in arms. And he's not even like the Hidares of Laredo. He's different. That's another group of people that are doing all kinds of different things. So he is left of center. I mean, right of sometimes, well, very, very different. By the way, he was very personally connected to Emma Tenayuca. These people have differences, but they also maintain relations in many instances. Emma Tenayuca, the head of the Communist Party in '39, is a very good friend of Perales. In fact, Perales is mentoring her. But when they get to the public square, they do not agree.
You just remind, I have this one correspondence between Clemente Hidar and Alonso Perales.
Yeah.
Where Hidar is asking him, how do I get young people to get to your position? And Perales gives like a page-long summary of, well, they need to go to business school, and then during the week, at nights, they go to night school, and they practice their typing, they practice their English. And he just had this like long list of things that everyone was supposed to do. And I just remember writing in the margins, like, who in Texas at this time can do this? You know, I mean, you'd have to, it would take the most extraordinary people to do it, but just the amount of time and effort that.
But that is a good strategy for getting ahead. And he kept advising young people to do whatever is necessary to get ahead educationally, to assume leadership positions in their communities. Honest leadership, he kept insisting. But that was the route.
Yeah.
You become a clerk.
Another orphan who became a clerk, Carlos Castañeda.
Yeah, you work in the oil fields in Veracruz.
Also in the archives, I mean, there's information that he worked in the cotton fields as well. He worked in the railroad as well. So I mean, he, in a way, when I read that, it kind of spoke of that, like his experience, like, you know, it's a struggle, but you can make it. Like there's sacrifices to be made, and he spoke about that. And I think in a more personal matter, and it kind of sounds harsh when you don't know more of his background. But yeah, definitely it's worth to explore.
What do these Mexicanos like Perales and Castañeda are doing with the Mexican Revolution and the Cristiada, with this massive refugee population of Catholics coming to the States?
They mostly reached out to the more established elected leadership in Mexico. At least Perales does not associate himself with insurgents or rebels. He as well as others in this community of leaders connect themselves. But an example, Lozano, the editor of La Prensa, works up a relationship with Vasconcelos and Ávila Camacho, to help Mexico reconstruirse by establishing schools. And they raise money to establish a school in Dolores Hidalgo, La Cuna de Libertad. And in that way, they insert themselves into the politics of Mexico by using the longing that is inherent in all of these folks. There's this long to go back to Mexico, the long to see Mexico restored. They use that kind of culture to get money, nickels, dimes, and quarters, raise, what is it, about $30,000 to establish a school. So they maintain relationships with the elected people. They don't support necessarily groups of folks that are up in arms against established authority. They don't intervene in that way, as far as I know. Not Perales, not Lozano, not Perales. In fact, well, they're moderate.
Castañeda is bringing a lot of Cristiada bishops to Austin and to Texas.
Yeah. Well, Castañeda is an interesting person. He's very much a part of this network with Perales, Canales from the Valley, with other people. But como decimos en español, le sirve una parte. He's an intellectual. He's translating the history to the people as an authority, a very charismatic, revered professor who's constantly being asked to come and speak about Mexican history. And that becomes part of the strategy. Know your history, know who you are. And but yeah, he's very close to the church in Mexico and here. Absolutely. We're colleagues organizing a conference from Carlos Castañeda in August, I think. I think it's going to be a good one. That's another one of those individuals. The question of women that you raise, I think is an important question. Women are there, but they're not allowed to be prominent. The formation of LULAC in 1929, for example, women were there, but they're not the picture as founders. They're cooking and cleaning, but they're there. They're the husbands and daughters, the wives and daughters of the leaders, and they're participating. They go to the meetings, they go everywhere, they're everywhere. Marta Perales, his wife, is always there with them, but she never speaks. She writes later. That's a patriarchal society. Women are involved in other things, mutualista organizations and all women organizations, literary clubs, church organizations, but they're not prominent in the civil rights movement until more or less beginning around the late 30s. De las Suels Bento is one of the first ones that begins to call for LULAC to open up to women, and they start organizing all women LULAC councils, in large part because of Adela Suels Bento and other women, Montemayor from Laredo. But women are not visible in these circles. They're visible in the radical organizations like the as well as the mutualistas, but the union movement includes women prominently because they're workers. They're seen as workers, not as wives or daughters. They're workers.
Emilio.
Yes.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on this book and the Price book.
Thank you.
I think what you've done basically is bring life to the ordinary people that you readers. I've always contended that academics, including historians, write for academics. They're not writing for the people, they're writing for each other.
That's right.
And what you've done by taking the voice of science and Perales and putting it out there for widespread use, their words, not your words necessarily. I'm sure you add to it and explain and so forth. But to me, it's very important that the general public reads what was happening by the intellectuals of their time. And the fact that they wrote in Spanish, and there were a lot of Mexican newspapers throughout South Texas, from San Antonio to the valley. My father published a newspaper in 1933 in Duval County in San Diego, which, by the way, as an aside, I'm really glad that science and Perales are getting the notice they needed, because some of the line, except for Perales, and he may have a connection to but they're from Perales and San Diego and Canito, that whole area, which was very important to develop South Texas. And they came de la gente, eran parte de la gente, and they wrote para la gente. And so it's important to me, I think very important to see that the USA historians are basically not stepping back, but facilitating these voices that are no longer heard. And I think it's very important.
Perales is not only an author of a novel on the San Diego Revolt that originated in San Diego, Texas, his hometown, but he's also a member and an officer of the LULAC County Historical Society that has been sponsoring a lot of very important historical events. Nati and I and other people attended the unveiling of
By the way, thank you for
yeah.
substituting for me at the last minute like that.
Yeah, you weren't, you were sick apparently. But it was a great event. I mean, the unveiling of a historical marker, acknowledging the San Diego Revolt, the Revolutionary Congress that gave direction to it in 1915. Of course, the ladies, mostly ladies involved in the society, had the reception at the church, which used to be a mercantile store.
Yeah,
it was wonderful. We took a lot of pictures. We really enjoyed it. I got Mona. Chris Carmona, who's also very involved in the ethnic studies campaign to expand the curriculum to include Mexicans and others for the State Board of Education. Nati is very involved in it as well. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, everyone. So, we run out of time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Emilio.
Yeah.